The average American consumes around 17 teaspoons of sugar per day. And I'm not talking about sugar found in fruits or vegetables either. Added sugar, okay? Sweets, candies, sodas, and even foods you might not expect, like pasta sauce and ketchup, all typically made with added sugar. It's everywhere. And 17 teaspoons is a lot. It's about the volume required to fill the inside of a tennis ball every single day. As a nation, we consume around 25 billion pounds of sugar every single year. And at a time when around 70% of the U.S. adult population is now overweight or obese, with rates of type 2 diabetes and other metabolic conditions on the rise, with credible estimates placing the number of deaths from obesity and diet-related disease at between 112,000 and over 600,000 Americans every single year, the implications of how we eat and what we eat have never been greater. Is sugar to blame? There are certainly those who think so. According to Dr. Robert Lustig, quote, insulin resistance is the root of metabolic syndrome, and sugar is a key driver of insulin resistance, end quote. But obesity and insulin resistance is far from the only concern. Potential linkages to cancer, mental health, and mood disorders have many of us considering whether it's time to cut sugar from our lives. But that might be easier said than done. That is certainly how I felt when I started to recognize that despite being lean, despite being in shape, sugar was quietly wreaking havoc on my life, in particular my mental health. In short, sugar was turning me into a monster, and I had to find a way to cut it out. With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel. It is so great to be back and to speak with you today, speak with you again. Today is a huge week. It's a big week for my family. I'm just going to go ahead and brag a little bit. My wife, who is an author, I got some exceptional news this week. Very, very proud of her. She's been working for years, honing her craft, getting better and better, and developing some books and writing books that I think a lot of people are going to be very excited about. I'm not sure if I can share the news. So for now, I'll just say it's awesome news. Very excited. Congratulations to her because she listens to the podcast. So that keeps me honest too. And so if you've been with me before, it's an exciting time. You can hear it in my voice. And today we've got an exciting episode. We're talking about sugar. We've had some heavy episodes over the last couple of weeks. Social media and smartphones, on the wild and crazy world of looks maxing. I just saw a few headlines today about clavicular. So if you haven't checked out that episode last week, very good episode, very timely episode. But we did do an episode on looks maxing. We did an episode on boosting testosterone naturally, right? All awesome episodes. So again, check those out if you've yet to do so. I'm happy how they turned out. And if you are new to the show, obviously welcome. Very glad to have you. As you may already know, my aim with the show is to explore and discuss ideas and concepts which I believe are at the core of reclaiming the radical health and fitness that is our birthright. There is something that strikes me as incredibly off about the modern approach to health and fitness. And while I certainly do not have all of the answers, right, I'm very much an explorer, very much somebody who is trying to figure this stuff out, I do believe that conversations like this one are a step in the right direction. We're going to have some fun today. And I do feel like that's important to say because I am starting to feel that I'm coming off a bit like the fun police. Okay. Alcohol is a poison. Pornography, it's just killing your testosterone. Smartphones and social media are causing depression and anxiety. And hey, you know what? Crystal meth for hollow cheeks might not be such a good trade. All right. And set down the hammer. Okay. Now, if you listen to the episode on looks maxing, you get those last two references, but you get the idea, okay? I don't want to come across as the fun police, but I have been coming across that way recently. But I do have one more today, and that is on sugar, right? That sweet, sweet crystalline white powder that tastes just so freaking good. And you know how sometimes people will say something about like a spice or a sauce, you know, like it's so good that I can just put it on everything? That is literally sugar. As modern Americans, we do put it on everything. We put it in everything. according to some estimates, we consume some 25 billion, right? Billion with a B, pounds of sugar per year as a nation. As individuals, that breaks out to about 60 to 80 pounds per person per year in added sugar, right? And again, to be clear, we're not talking about fruits and carrots here, right? We're talking about the processed kind, the added kind, the stuff in the cookies and packaged foods and sodas, okay? That kind. And let's be honest, it's likely the kind that is in all of your binge foods, right? Foods that, as was the case for me, you just have a hard time saying no to or consuming with any sense of moderation. But it's more than that. Sugar is so powerful, such a potent driver of taste and consumption, that it's even added as a flavor enhancer to many foods that you don't even likely associate with being sweet, right? Pasta sauce or ketchup. Why is sugar added as an ingredient in pasta sauce? Did you ask for that? I know I didn't. Is this some secret ingredient in traditional Italian cooking? I don't think so. It's because sugar has this incredible way of driving satisfaction with the food, even if we don't register the taste as sweet consciously. And given that sugar is cheap, it's ubiquitous, and generally not too objectionable if it's in small amounts, it's an incredibly profitable thing to add to food. According to Dr. Robert Lustig, sugar is now the most ubiquitous foodstuff worldwide and has been added to virtually every processed food, limiting consumer choice and the ability to avoid it. Approximately 80% of the 600,000 consumer packaged goods in the United States have added caloric sweeteners. When you add up the sources, the average American consumes about 17 teaspoons of added sugar per day. It's per day. That's a third of a cup. Just imagine you wake up in the morning and somebody hands you a tennis ball, right? And it's just chock full of sugar. It's completely packed. And, you just go about your day, just sprinkling some out, adding it to your meals. And at the end of the day, it's just completely gone. I mean, what we consume in sugar every single day as a nation, it's just incredible. And there's no other word for it. So is it any wonder that so many people, like me, have gotten hooked on sugar or have had a hard time kicking the habit once we're there? Now, if you are there, if sugar just has its hooks in you, as it did for me, fear not. Okay, there is light at the end of this tunnel. The choice is not between tasty modern foods or a lifetime of boiled broccoli and chicken breast. And of course, there is no shame in any of this. Okay, wherever you are in your journey, this has been and will continue to be a recurring theme of this show. But so often on issues related to health, to weight, to diet and fitness, there's a huge shame, judgment, and moral component. Sometimes real, and let's be honest, it's also sometimes imagined. But it's important to say now and to bang the drum loudly and often that there is just no moral consideration here. Okay, none. You're not a bad person if you consume sugar. You're not a good person if you don't. This just isn't in the category of moral, right? It's squarely in the category of effective for your goals and desired life or not effective to help you meet your goals and desired life, right? So never any shame, never any judgment, never any moral concerns. Anybody who is coming from that perspective, my advice, just tune them out, okay? Just get it out of here. No place in our discussion today. And of course, there would be no judgment anyways, but in this case, I certainly can't judge because I've been there. As I said, sugar really had its hooks in me. And interestingly, especially if you've listened to my past episodes on Ozempic or the one on how to lose weight naturally, keep it off, you may already know that I was almost 50 pounds heavier at one point. I didn't know it at the time, but I was officially in the category of obese based on BMI. Now, I did go on to lose the weight, but in my case, sugar had very little to do with it. I am going to share some of the struggles that I personally had with sugars, how it was negatively affecting me, but from a body fat perspective, from a weight perspective, it wasn't really a factor. But I will share details of my struggle, what clued me into the fact that sugar was really an issue in my life, despite being lean, despite being in shape. And of course, as always, we got to discuss the stakes and the context, right? Because it's super important for this issue, right? The why for this issue, just beyond my personal story. This is a topic that, as I've alluded to in the introduction, has massive implications for food, for health, and for society. And lastly, of course, I will just give you what worked very well for me, right? What worked very clearly in my case, and what a handful of these true difference makers were that allowed me to overcome just this incredible pull that sugar had on my life. So let's get into the stakes, the context, and the why for this episode. Now, we've hit on some of the scale and the scope in the introduction. Sugar is massive, just massive, both from the perspective of the amount that we consume and the size of the industry, as well as the potential health implications. And we're going to touch a little bit on each of these topics. As you are likely very aware, we are living through an unprecedented rise in obesity and metabolic dysfunction in the United States, as well as most of the, quote, developed world. At the time of this recording, over 40% of the adult American population is obese. Obese. And if you consider overweight or obese, that number jumps to 70%. 70% of the population. That's 2/3. It's a supermajority, right? Just really let that sink in. Conservative estimates place the number of deaths from obesity and diet-related diseases, such as diabetes, at somewhere around 112,000 Americans every single year. Other credible estimates, it's as high as 678,000. These are massive, massive numbers. 600,000 people is the entire city of Boston, just gone, every single year. It's the entire state of Wyoming. That's more dead every single year than all American lives lost in the wars of the 20th century combined, by a lot. And let's be honest, we don't need official health statistics to tell us that something is seriously off in the metabolic health of a nation. Go to any beach, amusement park, or sporting event, and the shapes and sizes of Americans has become completely unrecognizable in a rapid time. Now, how did all this happen? How did we skyrocket from an obesity rate of 15% in the 1970s to a near tripling just a few decades later? That is definitely the right question. And while I have my own bias, my own perspective, I'm not sure there's a single answer. But there are some who would point to sugar as a key driver of metabolic dysfunction. Again, Dr. Robert Lustig, let's recall that quote. Insulin resistance is the root cause of metabolic syndrome, and sugar is a key driver of insulin resistance. He points to the possibility that sugar is much more analogous to a slow toxin, which, like alcohol, doesn't typically kill in a single dose, but it weakens the body gradually over time. And in this case, it weakens the metabolism. He says, quote, sugar meets the criteria for a chronic dose-dependent toxin. It's not acute like cyanide. It is chronic. It depends on the dose, and we are way over the dose, end quote. And given some of the numbers we discussed earlier, the tennis ball size serving of sugar that the average American consumes daily, he may be onto something. But that's the body. And BMI, it's not really a perfect measure of metabolic health. And maybe one person's sense of desirable body aesthetics is different than another person's sense of aesthetics. Clearly, sugar doesn't always lead to obesity or to weight gain. It doesn't appear that it was a factor in my case. Fair point. But what about the mind? At the same time we witnessed a meteoric rise in rates of obesity and metabolic dysfunction in the United States, we've also experienced an alarming increase in mental illness, particularly in young adults and teenagers, with rates of depression, anxiety, and bipolar all on the rise. According to official government statistics on this, nearly 23% of U.S. adults had a mental illness in 2021, the latest year in the data set. That's over 1 in 5. It's actually closer to 1 in 4. But what is that number now? No idea. But given the steady increase up to that point, my hunch is it would probably be a lot worse. And again, while having the stats can be helpful to demonstrate this broader issue, my hunch is that you kind of already knew that. Mental illness affects so many of us, whether directly as individuals or indirectly through our friends and loved ones. In 2023, some 29 million Americans took a prescription medication for depression. That's 11% of the adult population. And that says nothing of those who choose to self-medicate. In previous episodes, we've discussed the role that social media and smartphones have played in eroding the mental health of young people, with a notable uptick in all of those markers in young people starting in 2010. And if you haven't checked out those episodes, definitely do so. Okay, we go in depth on the work of Jonathan Haidt in his incredible book, The Anxious Generation. Get a copy of that book. I always say get 2 copies of that book and definitely check that episode, okay? Especially if you have kids. In my view, this should be required reading, right, for any parent, in my humble opinion. And given what's come out already in the Epstein files, I feel stronger than ever that this is hugely important. I'll just say that. But might something more fundamental also be at play here? Might other lifestyle factors, including diet, also be playing a role in the erosion of our mental health and resilience as a society? If your hunch is yes, I'll say this: you're not alone. It turns out that obesity increases your risk of depression by around 50%. And this hasn't gone unnoticed by some in the scientific and medical community, that perhaps there is a link between whatever is at the core of metabolic dysfunction, particularly in young people again, the people who should be the happiest, the healthiest, and the most vital members of our society, and mental illness. That something is strong enough to inflict damage on the body, right? Damage on the mitochondria, damage on the metabolism. What are the odds that it would spare the brain? I think it's fair to say that for those working in the area of what's being referred to as metabolic psychiatry, those studying this connection and working to improve the mental health outcomes of patients through dietary and lifestyle interventions, which at the core target mental health, the odds are slim to none that, of course, the brain and the body, the brain and the gut, they're deeply connected. This is a subject which is near and dear to my heart personally, okay? Something we're going to go in more depth into in future episodes. But for now, I'll just say that some of the dietary and lifestyle interventions which target metabolic health as a means of improving mental health, whether it's through a ketogenic diet or exercise protocol or things like continuous glucose monitoring, they are incredible, okay? So many reasons, in my humble opinion, to be optimistic. And just real quick, okay, as an aside, some of you probably already know this, but the ketogenic diet, the significant reduction in the consumption of dietary sugar and carbohydrates in order to get the body to switch from burning sugar as fuel to burning fat as fuel, that wasn't developed as a fat loss diet. That was an intervention discovered in the 1920s by the Mayo Clinic as a treatment for epilepsy, okay, a chronic neurological disorder of the brain. Isn't that interesting? Right? More to come on that. Now, whether it's metabolic considerations, mental and mood considerations, or considerations regarding dental hygiene, something we haven't really discussed, but is certainly one of the primary factors for people considering a reduction in their overall sugar intake. Or maybe it's all of the above. There will be a subset of people who will be tempted to wonder if a sugar substitute might be the right answer. If sugars like cane sugar or high fructose corn syrup are wrecking my metabolism, hurting my brain, or destroying my teeth, is it possible to turn to a non-sugar sweetener as my savior? Is there a way to have my cake and eat it too? Right now, maybe with artificial sweetener. And from where I'm sitting, I don't think so. But let's talk cancer for a second, okay? That's a hell of a segue. I don't think it's controversial to say that sugars fuel cancer. In fact, cancer cells, from what I understand, are the only cells in the body, and yes, we have them in the body, even if we don't, quote, have cancer, but they are naturally occurring. They're constantly forming, and a healthy body has natural defense mechanisms that target and eradicate cancer cells as they form, right? Weird a bit, but also normal, I guess. Now, most of us know that cancer cells are unique in the sense that they are capable of replicating well beyond that of a normal cell. But people like Dr. Thomas Seyfried have argued that they're also unique in another very important way. They are the only cells unable to burn ketones as fuel. In other words, they are the only cells which aren't able to use fat as an energy source. I know, the plot freaking thickens. If cancer cells run almost exclusively on sugar, I'm oversimplifying here for a minute, and the healthy cells in our body do just fine in its absence, is it possible that cancer is a metabolic disease? According to people like Dr. Thomas Seyfried, yes, that's exactly what it is. Now, is he right about this? Again, we're going to have to save that question for now, but I will say this is definitely a guy who's going to be the subject of a future episode. And he's not alone. In fact, he's actually building on the work of many other people, including Otto Warburg, who made this connection back in the 1920s. He even won a Nobel Prize for his work in 1931. So is it possible that there is a link between the 25 billion pounds of sugar that we consume a year and the 4 in 10 Americans who will be diagnosed with cancer at some point in their lives? Maybe. And wait, what about the artificial sweeteners? Let's pick that thread back up. Is it possible that they're better? I'm not so sure. Right? It's been long rumored that these artificial sweeteners have a link between cancer. Aspartame was recently classified as a possible carcinogen by the WHO in 2023. Many others have long been suspected of being carcinogenic. And from what I understand, the evidence that artificial sweeteners could support weight loss or improved BMI is a mixed bag. Just given that so much of what makes up the body of scientific and nutrition studies is industry funded, and there's a big incentive for companies to show that their products are not harmful as opposed to the other way around, the precautionary principle applies in my view. Okay, I would tread very, very carefully and very slowly when it comes to artificial sweeteners. Okay, that's just my 2 cents, so take it for what it's worth. Whether we're talking obesity and metabolic health, mental health, mood, cancer, or teeth, maybe cutting sugar, maybe it's worth considering. And I know it's hard. Okay, I've been there. It was hard for me. But I got to a point where I could really see that it wasn't serving me. Right? My mood was really taking a hit. My mindset was really taking a hit. I'd never heard of metabolic psychiatry. I'd never heard of anybody else linking sugar and mental health. And although it did sneak up on me, I eventually did draw the connection. And I'll tell you how. Have you ever heard of a book called The 4-Hour Body? It's written by Tim Ferriss. It's going back 10, 15 years at this point. But this is one of the first books that popularized a cyclical ketogenic diet that he referred to as the slow carb diet. And unlike a traditional ketogenic diet, the slow carb diet, one, emphasizes the consumption of carbohydrates which are absorbed more slowly into the bloodstream, right? So think sweet potatoes, certain fruits, etc., as opposed to like the cookies, the pastas, the white rice, white potatoes, which are absorbed more quickly as measured by glycemic index, right? So how quickly do these foods spike your blood sugar? But 2, in order to combat the inevitable plateau in weight loss and fat loss that can occur with a sort of continuous traditional ketogenic diet, the body eventually does adapt. This diet features something unique. It features 1 binge day per week. Okay, yes, just 1 day in which you binge on all of the foods that you don't eat for the other 6 days of the week. Okay, so you got 6 days on basically doing a ketogenic diet and you have 1 day off. And the idea here is that this will prevent the body from adapting, thus allowing continued and sustained fat loss through this cycling process. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the book, it was big at the time, right? And a lot of people had really good results, some pretty incredible before and after photos from what I recall. And he had a little bit of a fitness program that went with it involving kettlebell swings, I think, or I think it was walking. And I had a lot of respect for Tim Ferriss. I mean, to be honest, I still do. So at the time, my wife and I, we decided to try it. Now, I had always had a bit of a sweet tooth. Okay. And we'll later in the episode, we're going to talk a little bit about my history and sort of how I got there. But the manner in which I started to consume sweets, given this slow carb diet, right? This 4-hour body diet, in which for multiple days of the week, I just had nothing, just cold turkey. And then one day I consumed a lot. Well, it didn't do much for my weight. Okay. The slow carb diet, it didn't really change my body or my body composition at all. I essentially stayed the same. But what it did do was it finally enabled me to recognize and to see the pattern, right? To see the link between my sugar consumption, my mood and my mental health, my mind space. And when I did, I didn't like what I saw. I don't know if this will make sense to anyone else, but the only way that I can describe it is that I would feel just a pressure in my head. Like if my wife and I ever got into an argument, which, yes, I know she's incredible. Yes, there are some times where married people will disagree. I know this is coming as a complete shock to people. Okay. But if we ever got into a disagreement and it was, say, the day after my binge day, this day after eating a lot of sugar, it was always terrible. Okay. And I would just feel this pressure in my head. It's the only way I can describe it. And it's like I would just get so mad about things that in hindsight, and even then I could just recognize really weren't that big of a deal. And honestly, I kind of felt like I was starting to become a bit of a monster to be around. It was definitely a low point. And if I look back at those times, I'm not proud. I know there were times that I just wasn't fun to be around. Now I'm grateful because it really showed me what sugar was doing to my body, my brain. And once I recognized that, I really had no choice. I just knew that I had to cut it out. So we've discussed the why, the stakes, the context. We've discussed some of my own personal struggles and what really woke me up, so to speak. But let's shift gears here. Let's get into how. Okay, how did I cut sugar, the sweets, the candies, the chocolates from my life? Well, there are two things that really, really helped. Okay, two things that I would say enabled me to liberate myself from what in hindsight was probably a decades-long death grip that sweets had over me. And I'll share what worked for me, and maybe they'll serve you as well. Okay, so for me, sugar consumption had become a habit, and habits are notoriously difficult to break. Now, was sugar a full-blown addiction? Not sure, but I was probably would have been the equivalent of like a functioning alcoholic, okay, with respect to sugar. I just know that when I did consume sugar, if I ever had a bag of candy or chocolates or sweets, once I started, I was going to eat the entire package, okay, pretty much regardless of size. And as much as I'd like to blame synthetic food dyes, right, that have been linked with attention and mood and ADHD, I can't even. Because in my case, it was mostly Trader Joe's dark chocolate peanut butter cups that were doing me in, that they just hit my taste buds in the best and worst possible way. Once I started, I'd eat pretty much all of them in a single day. It was just terrible. And once it became a habit, partially through the 4-hour body, partially through my shopping habits, it became very difficult to break. Now, one way that people try to break a habit is through substitution. They're taking an undesirable food, a substance, or a behavior, and trading it out for a less objectionable one. So maybe in this case, instead of eating like Trader Joe's peanut butter cups, try to eat something healthier with less sugar, right? Maybe something like an apple with peanut butter or sugar-free chocolate bar or something like that. But in general, that doesn't really work. Why is that? Because if we're being honest, it's a bad trade. Right? Think about it like this. A substitution is a trade, right? You are trading with yourself, one thing for another thing. And if you're being honest, if we're being fair, you wouldn't make that deal. Not really. In my case, I would actually prefer the chocolate peanut butter cups to the apple with peanut butter. I know that the other option is better for me, but in that case, what I would actually be doing is relying on willpower in order to white knuckle it and accept this worse, inferior alternative. Maybe that's worked for some people, but it can become very difficult, and it wasn't working in my case. Because once something is ingrained as a habit, it tends to be stronger than willpower, And willpower breaks down, especially during moments of stress. So in my view, it's not a great strategy. The only way that substitution works, the only way that it can work, as far as I can tell, is if we are substituting something that we like for something that we like even more, which makes complete sense, right? In that case, of course, we'd make that trade, like all day. But there is an important, absolutely mission critical caveat here. We are trying to break a habit. That is the point. So we have to trade for something that we like more, but it has to be something that is less addictive. I hope that makes sense. We like it more, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't have the same death grip on us that the original thing did. Now, how does that translate into my case? Well, when I started thinking about it, although I really, really did like dark chocolate peanut butter cups, and if you've never had them, okay, just do yourself a favor and just never do, okay? Just stay away from them. You are playing with fire if you like chocolate and if you like peanut butter. But if I were being honest, I liked them. But they weren't actually my favorite food in the world, right? There were foods that I actually did prefer. Going out to eat at one of my favorite spots in San Clemente, where we lived at the time, whether it was a place like South of Nick's, a place like Pizza Port, or even just a very tasty sushi joint, right? Something like Chinese dumplings, which we would make at home. All, if I'm being honest, preferable to dark chocolate peanut butter cups and way less addictive for whatever reason, right? We'll get into food science, we'll get into additives, we'll get into excitotoxins, all that stuff in future episodes. And I can maybe offer you at least some perspective as to why I think this has been based on at least some of the studying and research that I've done. But for now, we can just say that I think if you think about it, if sugar is an issue for you, and you said, given the entire universe of foods that you could eat, is that sugar, is that soda, is that candy, whatever it is that actually your favorite thing in the world? And I think in most cases, it probably isn't. But there is something about those other options, though, something quite obvious. Those other options tend to be more costly and less convenient, both in terms of money, but also in terms of time, right? Sugar is cheap, it's convenient, it's easy to consume, and it's literally everywhere, like 25 billion pounds of it. The gas station, the grocery store, you name it. And unlike alcohol, there's no social stigma associated with consuming it any time of the day, any day of the week. But in order for this to work, I have to consciously give myself permission to consume these other things in the absence of sugar. These are things that are, yes, costly, less convenient as an alternative to sugar. But the key point here is that it enabled me to break the habit. And again, I have to emphasize that because that is the only point. The only point here is to break the habit. It's not necessarily to make a healthier choice, right? And I think that's something that trips a lot of people up. All we're trying to do is break the habit, this hardwired, ingrained habit that is difficult to overcome because we've run that road so many times, right? And it just auto flows. Now, healthier would be amazing, but that's not the point. The point is a better trade for you and is less addictive. Then it will stick. Now, does this mean dinner out every meal at your favorite restaurant for a forever and ever amen? For most people, this isn't going to be reality. But here's the thing, you won't need it because I know that it seems hard to believe, but your taste buds will change. Okay, they will. They did for me. They've done for many other people as well. Now, why is that? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I'm completely speculating here, but my hunch is that it has something to do with our microbiome, right? That the more we feed certain strains of bacteria, the more that those become dominant, maybe signaling us to eat more of the foods that they like, right? Total speculation on my part, so take it with a grain of salt. But either way, I'm certainly not the first person to report that your taste buds will change, maybe in a month, maybe in a few weeks. But when they do, then guess what? You're free. And that's the point. And sugar will no longer have the same hold, the same death grip over your life that it once did. At this point, years into it at this point, I can eat a single piece of chocolate and not proceed to crush the entire bag, okay? And I can and do most of the time say no to dessert. Those dark chocolate peanut butter cups that obliterated my self-control, honestly, I don't even like them anymore, okay? They're too sweet. I still enjoy the taste of sweets, but by cutting sugar, my taste buds did evolve. This is a method that I've used very effective with cutting out sweets and cutting out alcohol, right? If you listen to that episode, same thing. I have found this to be very, very effective. And if you struggle with sweets or if you struggle with alcohol, right, follow the same thing. I've outlined that in the I Quit Alcohol episode, but give it a shot. I have a hunch it will work for you too. Now, in some ways, let's be honest, that's the bad news, right? Cutting out sweets, it's kind of a bummer, but there's some good news, especially if you're coming from the perspective of weight loss and fat loss and you enjoy food, which I do. The good news is you will get to eat more. There's this idea that is common within the plant-based community that is something like if you crave sweets, then what your body actually wants is protein. And if you crave salts, then what your body is actually telling you is that it wants minerals, right? Something to that effect. Now, if the word plant-based gets your panties in a twist, just go check out my episode on ending the diet wars, carnivore versus vegan. Okay, very important episode, regardless of where you stand. Shameless plug, of course, but you might be surprised. I'll just say that. But protein. If you struggle with sweets, if you really crave sweets, try upping your protein. Now, that might actually be what your body is telling you that it needs. And of course, by now, I shouldn't have to say that I am not talking about protein shakes and protein bars, okay? I am talking about real, nutrient-dense, whole foods, as clean as you possibly can afford to get, plenty of options across the plant and animal-based kingdoms, whether we're talking lentils, tempeh, sprouted seeds or nuts, or whether we're talking wild salmon, pasture-raised eggs, grass-fed beef. Doesn't matter to me. As long as we're talking real whole foods, just cut out all the processed proteins, cut out all the ultra-processed junk, fuel your body the way it evolved or was designed, and you will be happy with the results. Now, why does this work? There are many possible explanations for this, but one theory which might shed light onto this is what's called the protein leverage hypothesis. And in short, if you haven't heard this idea, it's the idea that bodies, right, whether animal or human, have this innate requirement for a certain amount of protein, or actually more accurately, a certain amount of amino acids, right, that our bodies will continue to give us the hunger signal until we meet that requirement. So if we eat food that's nutrient dense, high quality protein, full of amino acids that we need, we get that signal much faster. We eat a bunch of processed carbohydrates or candy, things completely devoid of protein, high in carbohydrates and sugars, we'll keep getting that signal, right? We'll keep getting the signal to eat more and more. Now, that's the protein leverage hypothesis, okay? And I think there's really something there. But I'm going to go ahead and give you my own little bit of bias here, right? My own editorializing, if you will. So just take this as something that I'm saying. Don't say that this is what the protein leverage hypothesis is. But I sort of think that it might be more than just protein. That you might even say it's the nutrient leverage hypothesis. Right? That if we're lacking in certain vitamins and minerals, just nutrients overall, including both fat, high quality, clean fats, and fiber, you're going to also still feel very hungry and less optimal. Okay, that's just my own bias, so take it for what it's worth. And again, I want to emphasize I'm talking real whole food sources, right? Clean sources. I'm not talking seed oils, I'm talking healthy fats. And check out my episode on seed oils, or just go directly to the excellent work of Dr. Catherine Shanahan if you're not sure what healthy fats are. She is definitely someone whose work you should be familiar with. And of course, fiber. And I'm not talking about just the occasional hit of Metamucil, right? So you're not constipated or something. Again, I'm talking about real, whole foods, clean sources, fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, all that good stuff. You know, when I personally upped my protein, my fat, and my fiber consumption, one of my personal favorites is just raw carrots. My craving for sugars dropped significantly. I don't think that's a coincidence. So those two things, some very selective, conscious substitution, a deal that I would actually make, right, a good trade, plus upping real, I'll say it again, whole foods, clean, organic, the highest quality that you can afford, protein, fat, and fiber, I was finally able to liberate myself from just this death grip that sugar had on me. And the difference in my mood, my mental health, and resilience, it was noticeable. And in my case, looking back on it, it was very, very worth it. Now, you might be wondering, because this was a few years ago, what do I do now? Do I ever consume any sugar, dessert, or am I completely cold turkey? And I would say for probably a year, maybe year and a half, I was cold turkey. Okay. I just didn't touch the stuff ever. I was never a soda guy. So really it came down to desserts, right? Chocolate, candies, that sort of thing. But after, probably a year and a half, I did experiment with having like a single piece of chocolate. And lo and behold, I found that I could tolerate it. Okay. No crazy mood impact. No need to go out and crush the entire bag. Just what I would describe as normal, right? Just a normal thing that I think maybe most people could do, or at least that was my perception. But for some reason, I found incredibly difficult, which is a good spot to be, right? You can take it or leave it. Enjoyable on occasion, maybe, but also not ruining my life and making the people I care about miserable, right? Just so important to me. Now, for those who have been with me for a while, you know that I'm a parent. And you might be wondering, what do I do with my own kids? I've said this before, but growing up, my parents were much more health conscious than most. Okay, while they still fell for the food pyramid, we basically followed like a more conscious version of the SAD diet, the standard American diet of the 1990s. Low fat, lots of carbs, vegetable oils, margarine, just the whole deal. Butter and eggs are the worst thing you can eat, all that. And we did kind of grow up with a zero tolerance policy on sweets. Not literally never, but we never had them in the house, right? Very, very much off limits for the most part. But the point is that I never really developed any sense of self-control. And maybe because I never had the practice. So when I was given the opportunity to make my own choices, right, I started working for myself, making my own money, having the ability to buy some of my own things, I just went nuts, right? And I kind of got hooked. So with my own kids, I am trying to avoid that because I do feel that that was a driver in my case. And they are pretty young, right? So full disclosure here. But my primary objective is for judgment, right? A theme of this podcast, theme of judgment. And of course, I'm not talking about thinking that you're better than other people or something like that. I'm talking about wisdom, discernment, these old timey notions that used to be such a common thing. Yeah, I'll tell you a little story. My daughter was riding in a horse show. I think it was her first one recently. And there was an older lady who was sitting there. She was sitting in a chair. I'm not sure if she could walk, but if I had to guess, I'd say she was probably maybe early 80s. But she was watching my daughter ride. And she looked at me and she says, "Is that your daughter?" And I said, "Yeah." And she was like, "Well, she rides beautifully." And I said, "Thank you." And she's like, "I can tell that she looks like a very sensible young lady." And I just love that. Like, there's just something so traditional, so old. And I mean that in the best possible way. That to have somebody described as sensible, as in having sense, as in having good judgment. I mean, I just took it as the greatest compliment that anybody could pay to one of my kids. Like, it really, really meant a lot to me. We don't talk like that anymore, but I think we will. I think people are waking up to the fact that it's not about any individual skill. It's not about any individual rule. You can't live like that. Certainly not at the rate that the world is changing. But judgment, that is the meta skill. And that's what I'm going for with my kids. Judgment, self-control, self-restraint, teaching that to the best of my ability. Am I going to be perfect? Of course not. But what I'm trying to do is not unwittingly build up sweets into the same sort of just desperate, I got to eat all I can because I'm not sure when I'll ever get another taste of this kind of a thing. And explain to the best of my ability in an age-appropriate manner why these things are important, why we choose to do the things that we do, and try to give a balanced view of both sides. Because eventually, somebody's going to come and make the counterpoint. And if you've never coached your kids onto what the counterpoint is, they're going to be very susceptible to that. right? And again, it's all age appropriate, et cetera, et cetera. I also want them eating as clean an option as possible, right? Staying away from the food dyes, the synthetic, the crazy ingredients. And they know about food dyes. It's funny. And I really do think that more so than just the sort of logical component, the brain component, if you will, I do believe that this will help inform their taste buds. If you've ever been to places like Japan or China, lots of places in Asia, they also do enjoy sweets. But if you'll notice, the sweets that they eat aren't nearly as sweet, right? Many American companies, when they've gone to these markets, they've had to reformulate their chocolate bars, their sodas, to make them less sweet, to appeal to the local palate. Does it mean that their taste buds have been educated in a slightly different way? I think so. I think it's at least a reasonable assumption. So what we aim for is simple. We give them a piece of dessert every day. It's usually something small, like a piece of Hu chocolate. I like Hu chocolate because it's got simple ingredients. It's made with coconut sugar. It's organic, right? All better choices in my view, as clean as I can possibly get. And we typically do it in the morning. And one of the added benefits of doing this is that if we're out and they're ever offered something that's got like a full load of ingredients that we would really prefer that they don't eat, right? Just a bunch of synthetic food dyes and high fructose corn syrup, and I don't know, maybe throw in seed oils for good measure. We have our answer. We've already had our dessert for today. Are we perfect about it? No, of course not. But do my kids have the same desperate for desire for sweets that I did as a kid? So far, no. So if you have kids and it's not too late, give it a shot. Let me know how it works, and hopefully it serves you too. Okay, so we've talked about a lot today. We have talked about some of the impacts of sugar, the size of the industry. We have talked about cancer, metabolic health. We've talked about metabolic psychiatry, all subjects that we're going to dive into in more detail in later episodes. We've talked about my own personal experiences with sugar and two things that really, really worked in my case to help just, again, liberate me from this death clutch that sugar had over me. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. If you are enjoying the show, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, all that good stuff. I'm told it helps the show out. This is still very, very much a baby, kind of toddler, drooly podcast. So if you are enjoying it, drop me a line. Would love to hear from you. And I will see you again next week.